The autumn wind swept across the rolling hills of rural Kentucky, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter's approach. 23-year-old Jessica Palmer had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of Whitman County, places where time seemed to stand still and nature reclaimed what civilization had abandoned. As a freelance photographer specializing in forgotten Americana, she made her living capturing the haunting beauty of decaying barns, rusted machinery, and structures that told stories of bygone eras. Her work had been featured in several regional magazines, and she had developed a reputation for finding the most evocative abandoned locations throughout the southeastern United States. On that crisp October morning, Jessica packed her camera equipment and set out for the old Henderson property, a sprawling tract of land that had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. Local folklore spoke of hidden treasures and forgotten wells scattered across the property, remnants of a time when the land had been a thriving homestead. The current owners, distant relatives of the original family, lived in California and had little interest in maintaining the property, leaving it to slowly return to the wilderness. Jessica had obtained permission to photograph on the land weeks earlier, after tracking down the owners through county records and explaining her artistic project documenting America's forgotten rural heritage. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of oak and maple trees as she drove down the winding country road that led to the property. The landscape was quintessentially Kentucky, rolling hills covered in hardwood forests, with occasional clearings where old farmsteads had once thrived. Stone fences, built by hand more than a century ago, still marked property boundaries, though many had gaps where trees had fallen or frost had shifted the carefully placed rocks. The beauty of the region was undeniable, but there was also a melancholy quality to these abandoned places, a sense of dreams deferred and lives interrupted by the inevitable march of time and economic change. Before we continue with Jessica's journey, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support means everything to us, and hearing from viewers around the world makes these stories even more meaningful. Now let's return to that fateful October morning that would change Jessica's life forever. Jessica parked her dusty Honda Civic at the edge of the property, where a rusted gate hung open on broken hinges. The metal creaked in the autumn breeze, creating an almost musical sound that seemed to welcome her to this forgotten place. She shouldered her camera bag, checked that her backup batteries were charged, and began walking down the overgrown path that led deeper into the property. Her boots crunched softly on the carpet of fallen leaves, brilliant reds and golds that created a natural mosaic beneath the towering trees. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy smell of decomposing vegetation and the distant sound of a creek babbling somewhere in the woods. As she explored the property throughout the morning, Jessica discovered the remnants of what had once been a substantial homestead. Foundation stones marked where buildings had once stood, a main house, several outbuildings, and what appeared to have been a large barn. Rusted farm equipment lay scattered like the bones of some ancient beast, slowly being reclaimed by the encroaching forest. An old plough, its metal surfaces oxidized to a deep orange-brown, sat partially buried beneath a pile of fallen logs. Apple trees, now wild and unpruned, still bore fruit, their branches heavy with small, tart apples that deer had begun to claim. The trees formed a rough orchard pattern, evidence of the careful planning that had once characterized this place. She spent the morning photographing these silent witnesses to a forgotten way of life, each image telling a story of dreams built and eventually abandoned. Through her camera lens, she captured the way morning light filtered through broken windows in a collapsed outbuilding, the delicate frost patterns on rusted metal, and the way nature had begun to reclaim human-made structures. These weren't just photographs. They were historical documents, preserving the memory of a way of life that was rapidly disappearing from the American landscape. The Henderson family had been among the original settlers in this part of Kentucky, arriving in the 1880s with dreams of building a prosperous farm. According to the local historical society records Jessica had researched, they had raised cattle and horses, grown tobacco and corn, and been pillars of the small rural community that had once thrived in this area. The Great Depression had been hard on the family, and by the 1950s, the younger generation had moved to cities in search of better opportunities. The old homestead had been gradually abandoned, with the last family members leaving in the early 1990s. It was around noon when Jessica noticed something unusual near what appeared to be the remains of the old barn. Partially hidden beneath a tangle of blackberry vines and fallen timber, she spotted what looked like a circular stone structure. Her pulse quickened with excitement. This could be exactly the kind of authentic historical detail that would make her photograph series truly special. Curious, she pushed through the vegetation, ignoring the thorns that snagged at her jeans and jacket. The brambles were thick and aggressive, evidence of years of unchecked growth, but Jessica was determined to uncover whatever lay beneath. As she cleared away the debris, working methodically with her hands and a small folding knife she carried for exactly this type of situation, her excitement grew. It was clearly an old well, probably hand-dug decades ago, with carefully laid stones forming a perfect circle about 4 feet in diameter. The craftsmanship was impressive. Each stone had been carefully selected and fitted to create a structure that had withstood decades of weather and neglect. This was the kind of authentic historical feature that could serve as the centerpiece of her entire photo series about the Henderson property. The well appeared to be covered by several rotted wooden planks and a piece of rusted corrugated metal, all held down by a few large stones that had probably been placed there decades ago as a safety measure. Jessica could see that time and weather had taken their toll on the covering. Some of the boards had partially collapsed inward, creating dangerous gaps in what should have been a solid barrier. The metal sheeting was corroded through in several places, and the whole covering system looked precarious at best. She knelt beside the structure, fascinated by the craftsmanship of the stonework and the stories this well might hold. Wells like this were typically dug by hand, often to depths of 30 feet or more, and represented enormous investments of time and labor for frontier families. The water would have been essential for the homestead's survival, supporting not just the family, but also their livestock and crops. As she examined the stonework more closely, Jessica could see tool marks in some of the stones, evidence of the careful hand-shaping that had been necessary to create such a precisely fitted structure. As she adjusted her camera settings to capture the intricate details of the stonework, Jessica noticed that one of the covering boards shifted slightly under her weight as she leaned against it for stability. She should have been more careful, should have tested the stability of the covering before putting her full weight near the edge, but her photographer's instincts had taken over. She wanted the perfect shot, the image that would capture not just the physical structure, but the sense of mystery and abandonment that surrounded it. The lighting was perfect, filtered sunlight, creating dramatic shadows that emphasized the texture of the old stones. The board gave way with a sudden crack that echoed through the quiet morning air, the sound sharp and final in the peaceful forest setting. Jessica felt herself falling, her camera bag sliding off her shoulder as she desperately grabbed for something, anything, to stop her descent. Her fingers scraped against the rough stone walls as she tumbled into the darkness below, the circle of sunlight above her growing smaller and more distant with each passing second. The fall seemed to last forever, though it was probably only a few seconds before she hit the bottom with a jarring impact that knocked the wind from her lungs and sent sharp pains shooting through her left ankle and shoulder. The impact was devastating. Jessica's body struck the bottom of the well with tremendous force, her left ankle twisting at an unnatural angle as it absorbed much of the impact. Pain exploded through her leg, so intense that for a moment she thought she might lose consciousness. Her shoulder struck the stone wall during her fall, sending another wave of agony through her upper body. But even worse than the physical pain was the immediate realization of her situation. She was trapped at the bottom of a deep well, injured, alone, and with no immediate prospect of rescue. Darkness enveloped her like a living thing, so complete that she couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The musty smell of damp earth and stagnant water filled her nostrils, and she could feel cold moisture seeping through her clothes. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering down from the gap far above, Jessica realized she was sitting in about 2 feet of murky water at the bottom of what must be a very deep well. The walls stretched up into shadows, smooth stone surfaces that offered no handholds or hope of climbing out on her own. The water was shockingly cold, immediately beginning to leach heat from her body through her clothing. Panic began to set in as the reality of her situation became clear. She was trapped in an abandoned well on property that rarely saw visitors, with no cell phone signal. She had noticed earlier that morning that her phone showed no bars in this remote location. No one was expecting her back until evening at the earliest, and even then, her friends and family were accustomed to her disappearing for days at a time on photography expeditions. Her camera bag lay partially submerged beside her, the expensive equipment likely ruined by the stagnant water. More concerning was the pain in her ankle, which was already beginning to swell, and the deep ache in her shoulder that suggested she'd done more than just bruise it in the fall. Jessica forced herself to remain calm, drawing on the survival instincts her grandfather had taught her during childhood camping trips in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. He had been a World War II veteran who believed in teaching practical skills, and his lessons about staying calm in crisis situations had stayed with her throughout her life. She needed to assess her situation rationally and conserve her energy. The well was clearly old and deep, probably at least 25 to 30 feet to the bottom, with smooth stone walls that would be impossible to climb even if she weren't injured. The water at the bottom was cold, but not freezing, and while it smelled stagnant, it didn't appear to be rising. Looking up at the circle of light far above her head, Jessica could see that the collapsed board had left a gap in the covering. But it wasn't large enough for her to fit through, even if she could somehow reach it. The opening appeared to be maybe 18 inches across, large enough to let in some light and air, but far too small for a human body. She tried calling for help, projecting her voice upward with all the strength she could muster, but her calls seemed to be swallowed by the deep shaft, and she knew there was no one around to hear her anyway. The Henderson property was isolated, surrounded by miles of farmland and forest, with the nearest neighbor at least a mile away. The first day in the well was a nightmare of cold, pain, and growing despair. As the hours passed and the circle of light above her head tracked across the sky, Jessica began to understand the true nature of her predicament. The autumn air was growing colder, and the temperature at the bottom of the well seemed to drop even further as the sun moved across the sky above. She tried to keep moving to maintain circulation and body heat, but the confined space and her injured ankle made movement difficult and painful. The water in which she sat was gradually sapping her body heat, and she knew hypothermia would become a real concern as night approached. Her ankle had swollen dramatically, straining against her hiking boot until the pressure became almost unbearable. She could barely put any weight on it at all, and she suspected it might be broken rather than just sprained. The pain in her shoulder had settled into a constant throbbing ache that made it difficult to find any comfortable position in the cramped space. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body, and she had to force herself to keep moving despite the discomfort, knowing that staying active was essential to preventing her condition from deteriorating further. As darkness fell on her first night in the well, the temperature dropped dramatically. Jessica's wet clothes offered little protection against the cold, and she found herself shivering uncontrollably as hypothermia began to set in. She had managed to position herself in the shallowest part of the water, but there was no way to get completely dry. The stone walls radiated cold, and every surface she touched seemed to draw more heat from her already chilled body. She dozed fitfully, jolting awake each time her head nodded forward, or when the pain in her ankle flared. Strange sounds echoed in the darkness above her, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. Each sound made her hope for a moment that rescue might be coming, but the night passed in solitude. Dawn brought little relief from her suffering. The circle of light above her head grew brighter as the sun rose, but the sun's rays couldn't penetrate deep enough into the well to provide any warmth. Jessica's lips were blue with cold, and her injured ankle had swollen to the point where her boot felt tight and uncomfortable. She had managed to fish her water bottle from her camera bag, giving her something clean to drink, but she had no food and no way to stay warm. The water bottle contained maybe 16 ounces of liquid, not nearly enough to sustain her for more than a day or two. She spent the second day trying different strategies to attract attention or escape on her own. She attempted to stack stones to create steps up the wall, but the stones at the bottom of the well were too small and unstable to support her weight, and her injured ankle made it impossible to climb even a short distance. She tried using her camera strap as a rope, but it wasn't nearly long enough to reach the top of the well. She called for help periodically throughout the day, timing her calls for when she thought people might be most likely to be in the area. But her voice grew weaker as dehydration began to set in. The psychological toll of her situation was almost as difficult to bear as the physical suffering. Jessica found herself cycling through emotions: anger at her own carelessness, fear about her chances of survival, desperate hope that someone would find her, and periods of deep despair when the reality of her situation seemed overwhelming. She thought about her parents, who lived in Ohio and weren't expecting to hear from her for several days. She thought about the photographs still on her camera's memory card, images that captured the beauty of forgotten places, but might themselves be forgotten if she didn't survive. The third day brought new challenges that tested her resolve to its limits. Hunger began to gnaw at her stomach with increasing intensity, and the constant cold seemed to penetrate deeper into her bones with each passing hour. Her fingers had become stiff and clumsy from the cold, making it difficult to perform even simple tasks, like opening her water bottle. She tried calling for help periodically throughout the day, but her voice was growing hoarse and weak. The effort of shouting upward required energy she could barely spare, but she knew it might be her only chance of attracting attention if someone did happen to pass by. Dehydration was becoming a serious concern. Her single water bottle was nearly empty, and she was faced with the terrible choice of drinking the stagnant well water or facing severe dehydration. The water around her was clearly contaminated. It had an unpleasant smell and contained decades of accumulated debris, dead insects, and organic matter. She knew that drinking it could make her seriously ill, but she also knew that severe dehydration would be fatal much more quickly than waterborne illness. By the fourth day, Jessica's condition had deteriorated significantly. She had been forced to drink small amounts of the well water, and her stomach cramped with nausea as her body rejected the contaminated liquid. Her injured ankle had turned an alarming shade of purple and black, and she was certain now that it was broken. The constant pain had become a dull, persistent companion that made it difficult to think clearly or sleep for more than short periods. She found herself talking aloud, partly to keep her mind active and partly because the sound of her own voice provided some small comfort in the oppressive silence of her stone prison. The nights were the worst part of her ordeal. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Jessica would huddle in the shallowest part of the well, trying desperately to conserve whatever body heat she had left. She had learned to recognize the sounds of the night, the calls of different owl species, the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes that reminded her of how isolated she was. Sometimes she would imagine she heard human voices or the sound of vehicles, but these always turned out to be false hopes created by her increasingly desperate state of mind. By the 5th day, Jessica was barely conscious for long periods. Hypothermia, dehydration, and infection from her injuries had combined to create a life-threatening medical crisis. She had stopped calling for help regularly, saving her voice and energy for moments when she thought she heard sounds from above. Her body was shutting down, conserving energy for essential functions, and she found herself sleeping more and more as the hours passed. In her more lucid moments, she began to accept that she might not survive this ordeal, and she tried to make peace with that possibility. Her thoughts during these dark hours turned to the people she would leave behind, and the life she might never get to live. She thought about her parents, who had always supported her artistic ambitions, even when they worried about her tendency to take risks in pursuit of the perfect photograph. She thought about the stories she had hoped to tell through her work, the forgotten places and forgotten people whose histories deserved to be preserved. Most of all, she thought about how such a simple mistake, leaning against a rotted board, had led to this desperate situation. It was on the morning of the 6th day that Jessica first heard the sound that would ultimately save her life. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rumble of large engines, different from the occasional car that passed on the county road nearly a mile away. This sound was closer, heavier, and seemed to be coming from multiple directions. She forced herself to sit up straighter in the cold water, listening intently as the sounds grew louder and closer. Her heart began to race with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Could it really be that rescue was finally at hand? What Jessica didn't know was that her disappearance had finally been reported to authorities. Her editor at the regional magazine where she freelanced, a man named Robert Flynn, had grown increasingly concerned when she missed an important deadline and failed to respond to multiple emails and phone calls. Jessica was known for being reliable and professional, and it was completely out of character for her to miss a deadline without communication. After trying unsuccessfully to reach her for 2 days, Flynn had contacted her parents in Ohio, only to discover that they hadn't heard from her either and were beginning to worry. Jessica's mother, Patricia Palmer, had immediately called the sheriff's office in Whitman County to report her daughter missing. She provided deputies with information about Jessica's photography work and her habit of exploring abandoned properties, though she didn't know the specific location where her daughter had planned to shoot. The investigation had taken time. Deputies had to track down Jessica's recent assignments and interview people who might know where she had gone. It wasn't until they found her car parked at the Henderson property that they had a specific location to search. The sound Jessica was hearing was the rumble of all-terrain vehicles and the diesel engines of emergency response trucks as search and rescue teams spread out across the Henderson property. Sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, emergency medical technicians, and members of the county search and rescue unit had converged on the area at dawn, determined to find the missing photographer. They had been working systematically through the property for hours, checking every building foundation, every piece of abandoned equipment, every place where someone might have become trapped or injured. The search teams were led by Deputy Sheriff Michael Brooks, a veteran law enforcement officer with more than 15 years of experience in search and rescue operations. Brooks had coordinated dozens of missing person searches throughout his career, and he knew that time was critical. Jessica had been missing for nearly a week, and the chances of finding her alive decreased with each passing hour. The October weather had been unusually cold, with nighttime temperatures dropping into the 30s, and hypothermia was a serious concern for anyone trapped outdoors. With renewed energy born of desperate hope, Jessica began to shout with what little strength she had left. Her voice was hoarse and weak after days of calling for help, but she put everything she had into her cries for assistance. "Help! I'm here! I'm in the well! Help me!" She called upward through the narrow shaft, praying that somehow her voice would carry far enough to reach the search teams she could hear moving through the property above. Above ground, the search teams had been working methodically through the property since dawn. The abandoned homestead covered nearly 40 acres, much of it overgrown with thick vegetation that made searching difficult and time-consuming. Volunteers from the County Search and Rescue Unit, many of whom had given up their weekend to help find the missing photographer, spread out in a grid pattern to ensure that no area was overlooked. They carried portable radios to maintain communication and had been trained to look for any signs of human presence: disturbed vegetation, pieces of clothing, footprints, or any indication that someone had passed through an area. It was volunteer firefighter David Chen who first heard the faint sounds coming from beneath the tangle of vines and debris near the old barn foundation. At first, he thought it might be an animal trapped in the underbrush, or just the wind playing tricks on his ears. But as he moved closer to investigate, the sounds became clearer. Someone was definitely calling for help, and the voice was coming from underground, a discovery that sent a chill of realization through him. "Over here," David shouted to the rest of the search team, his voice carrying across the property with urgent intensity. "I think I found her. The sounds are coming from underground." Within minutes, the area around the old well was swarming with rescue personnel. Deputy Brooks radioed for additional equipment and medical support, while the search and rescue team began carefully clearing away the debris that covered the well opening. The work had to be done carefully. They couldn't risk having more of the covering collapse and potentially injure Jessica further or make the rescue more difficult. As they removed the broken boards and corrugated metal piece by piece, they could finally see down into the darkness below. A powerful LED flashlight beam pierced the darkness of the well shaft, and suddenly Jessica's pale, upturned face was visible nearly 30 feet below the surface. She was alive, conscious, and responsive, a discovery that brought cheers from the assembled rescue workers. After days of uncertainty and growing fears about what they might find, the sight of the missing photographer looking back up at them was an emotional moment for everyone involved in the search. "Jessica Palmer?" Deputy Brooks called down into the well, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Can you hear me? We're going to get you out of there." The sound of her own name being called by a rescue team was the most beautiful thing Jessica had ever heard. After 6 days of solitude, cold, pain, and growing despair, the knowledge that help had finally arrived filled her with a surge of hope and energy she hadn't felt in days. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she looked up at the circle of faces peering down at her from above. "Yes, it's me!" she called back, her voice cracking with emotion and the effects of days of exposure. "I'm hurt, but I'm alive. My ankle is broken, and I'm very cold." The rescue operation that followed was a carefully coordinated effort involving multiple agencies and specialized equipment. The Whitman County Fire Department's technical rescue team was called in to handle the complex extraction, while paramedics prepared to treat Jessica for hypothermia, dehydration, and her obvious injuries. The well was too deep and the walls too smooth for a simple rope rescue. They would need specialized equipment and techniques to safely extract an injured person from such a confined space. Fire Captain James Wilson, who commanded the technical rescue team, assessed the situation and determined that they would need to use a tripod rescue system with a mechanical winch. The equipment had to be transported to the site and carefully positioned over the well opening. Meanwhile, emergency medical technician Lisa Rodriguez prepared to be lowered into the well to assess Jessica's condition and provide immediate medical care. The rescue teams worked with practiced efficiency, but every step had to be carefully planned and executed. Jessica had already been trapped for 6 days, and any mistake could result in further injury or delay her extraction even longer. As the technical rescue equipment was set up, other team members worked to clear a path for the ambulance and establish a landing zone in case helicopter evacuation became necessary. Lisa Rodriguez was an experienced EMT with specialized training in confined space rescue operations. As she was lowered into the well on a rescue harness, she carried medical supplies and thermal blankets to begin treating Jessica's hypothermia and assess her injuries. The descent into the narrow shaft was challenging. She had to be careful not to dislodge any loose stones that might fall on Jessica, and she had to maneuver her equipment through the tight space. When Lisa reached the bottom of the well, she was struck by Jessica's condition, but also by her remarkable resilience. After 6 days in these conditions, many people would have been unconscious or worse, but Jessica was alert and able to communicate clearly. The EMT immediately wrapped Jessica in thermal blankets and began checking her vital signs while radioing her assessment to the medical team above. "Patient is conscious and alert," Lisa reported through her radio. "Obvious hypothermia, appears dehydrated. Possible fracture of the left ankle. Patient reports pain in left shoulder. Pulse is weak but regular. We need to get her out of here as quickly as possible." The extraction process required careful coordination between the rescue teams above and below. Jessica was fitted with a specialized rescue harness that would distribute the forces of the lift across her body and prevent further injury to her damaged ankle. The harness was designed for exactly this type of rescue, with multiple attachment points and padding to protect the victim during the extraction process. As the mechanical winch slowly began to raise both women toward the surface, Jessica caught her first glimpse of the faces of her rescuers. People who had given up their weekend and risked their own safety to save a complete stranger. The walls of the well slid past as she was lifted toward the circle of daylight that had been her only connection to the outside world for 6 long days and nights. The moment Jessica emerged from the well into the bright October sunshine was one of the most emotional scenes many of the veteran rescue workers had ever witnessed. After days of uncertainty about whether they would find her alive, seeing the young photographer finally safe was a powerful reminder of why they had chosen to dedicate their time to search and rescue work. The assembled team of deputies, firefighters, EMTs, and volunteers broke into spontaneous applause as Jessica was lifted clear of the well opening. But the rescue was far from over. Jessica's condition was serious, and she needed immediate medical attention. Paramedics quickly transferred her from the rescue harness to a specialized stretcher designed for backcountry evacuations. Her core body temperature was dangerously low, and she was showing signs of severe dehydration and possible infection from her injuries. IV lines were started to begin fluid replacement, and heated blankets were wrapped around her to begin the process of gradually raising her body temperature. The trip from the well site to the waiting ambulance was accomplished using an all-terrain vehicle equipped with a patient transport system. The rough terrain of the abandoned property made it impossible for the ambulance to reach the actual rescue site, so the paramedics had to stabilize Jessica for transport across several hundred yards of uneven ground. Every bump and jolt was carefully monitored to ensure that her condition didn't deteriorate during the transport. As the ambulance raced toward Whitman County General Hospital with lights and sirens, Jessica drifted in and out of consciousness. The warmth of the heated ambulance and the professional care of the paramedics were luxuries beyond anything she had imagined during her darkest hours in the well. IV medications began to ease her pain, and for the first time in 6 days, she felt truly safe. The emergency department at Whitman County General Hospital had been alerted about the incoming rescue victim, and a full trauma team was standing by when the ambulance arrived. Jessica was quickly transferred to a treatment room, where doctors began the comprehensive process of treating her multiple medical issues. X-rays confirmed that her ankle was indeed fractured in 2 places, and her shoulder showed signs of significant soft tissue damage from the fall. But the most serious concerns were the systemic effects of her ordeal. Jessica's core body temperature was several degrees below normal, indicating moderate hypothermia. Her blood tests showed severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalances that would require careful correction over several days. There were also signs of early kidney damage from the dehydration, and doctors were concerned about possible infection from the contaminated water she had been forced to drink. Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency department physician who oversaw Jessica's initial treatment, was amazed by her patient's condition considering what she had endured. 6 days in those conditions would have killed most people, Dr. Williams later told reporters. Her survival is a testament to her physical fitness and mental toughness, but also to the quick response of our search and rescue teams once she was reported missing. The news of Jessica's dramatic rescue quickly spread beyond Whitman County. The story of a young photographer trapped alone in an abandoned well for 6 days captured the attention of regional and then national media. News crews arrived at the hospital seeking interviews, and Jessica's story was featured on television networks across the country. The dramatic nature of her ordeal, combined with the successful rescue operation, provided a compelling human interest story that resonated with audiences nationwide. Jessica's parents arrived from Ohio within hours of being notified about the rescue, and their reunion with their daughter was emotional for everyone involved. Patricia Palmer had spent the past week imagining the worst possible outcomes, and seeing Jessica alive and receiving excellent medical care was an overwhelming relief. The family expressed their profound gratitude to everyone involved in the search and rescue operation, from the sheriff's deputies who coordinated the search to the volunteers who gave up their weekend to help find a stranger. Deputy Sheriff Brooks visited Jessica in the hospital the following day to get her official statement about what had happened, and he brought with him something that made Jessica's eyes fill with tears: her camera, retrieved from the bottom of the well. The camera body was ruined by water damage and would never function again, but the memory card had been protected by the camera's weather sealing and was completely intact. With it were all the photographs she had taken on that fateful morning before her fall, images that now held special significance as the last pictures she had taken before her ordeal began. "Your pictures are beautiful," Deputy Brooks told her as he showed her some of the images that had been recovered from the memory card. "Even after everything you went through, these shots of the old homestead really capture something special about that place. That well you fell into, it's going to be properly sealed now, so this can never happen to anyone else." Jessica looked at the photographs with new eyes, seeing not just the beauty of forgotten places, but also the hidden dangers that lurked in seemingly peaceful settings. The image she had been trying to capture when she fell, the detailed stonework of the well opening, seemed almost prophetic now, a warning about the risks of exploring abandoned places alone. But she also saw the artistic value in the work she had been doing, and she knew that her passion for documenting America's forgotten places hadn't been diminished by her traumatic experience. The recovery process was long and challenging. Jessica remained in the hospital for more than a week while doctors treated her hypothermia, dehydration, and infections. Her broken ankle required surgery to repair the fractures, and she faced months of physical therapy to regain full use of her leg. The psychological effects of her ordeal were also significant. She experienced nightmares about being trapped in dark, confined spaces, and she found herself becoming anxious in situations where she felt unable to escape. But Jessica was determined not to let her traumatic experience define her or end her career as a photographer. With the support of her family and the medical team, she began the process of physical and emotional recovery. The outpouring of support from complete strangers, people who had followed her story in the news and been moved by her ordeal, provided additional motivation for her recovery. Letters and cards arrived at the hospital from across the country, many from people sharing their own stories of survival or expressing admiration for her resilience. During her time in the hospital, Jessica also had the opportunity to meet and thank many of the people who had been involved in her rescue. Volunteer firefighter David Chen, who had first heard her calls for help, visited to check on her recovery. EMT Lisa Rodriguez stopped by to see how her patient was doing. Deputy Sheriff Brooks provided updates on the investigation and the steps being taken to secure the well site. Each of these encounters reminded Jessica of the incredible network of dedicated people who had worked together to save her life. The rescue had changed Jessica's perspective on many things, but it hadn't dampened her passion for photography or her love of exploring forgotten corners of America. If anything, the experience had given her a deeper appreciation for the stories these places held and the importance of approaching them with proper caution and preparation. She began planning her return to photography even before she was discharged from the hospital, though she knew her methods would have to change significantly. When Jessica finally left the hospital 3 weeks after her rescue, she was walking with crutches and facing months of rehabilitation. But she was alive and determined to rebuild her life and career. The media attention had brought her work to a much wider audience than she had ever reached before, and she was already receiving inquiries from publishers and galleries interested in her photographs of abandoned America. Her experience had transformed her from a regional photographer into a nationally recognized artist and survivor. The old Henderson property was eventually sold to new owners who took immediate steps to secure the dangerous well and clear other hazards from the site. The well was properly capped with a concrete cover that could never collapse, and warning signs were posted throughout the property. But Jessica's photographs of the place, including the haunting images of the well that nearly claimed her life, became part of a traveling exhibition about forgotten America that toured museums and galleries across the country. Her story became more than just a tale of survival. It became a powerful reminder about both the hidden dangers in abandoned places and the incredible dedication of search and rescue volunteers who worked tirelessly to bring missing people home safely. Jessica used her newfound platform to advocate for better safety education for photographers and explorers who venture into abandoned properties, and she worked with search and rescue organizations to raise awareness about their vital work. The experience had taught her that survival isn't just about physical endurance, it's about maintaining hope even in the darkest circumstances and never giving up the belief that somewhere, somehow, people are looking for you and working to bring you home. The sound of her name being called by rescuers after 6 days of solitude had been more than just a signal that help had arrived. It had been the sound of hope itself, echoing down through 30 feet of darkness to remind her that she was not alone in the world. Years later, when Jessica looked back on those 6 days in the well, she remembered not just the cold, the pain, and the fear, but also the moment when she heard the voices of her rescuers calling her name. That moment had taught her something profound about the human capacity for hope and the power of community, that even in our darkest hours, there are people working to bring us back to the light. For Jessica Palmer, those faint knocking sounds and voices calling her name hadn't just alerted rescuers to her location. They had been a reminder that no matter how alone we might feel, There are always people who care enough to keep looking, keep searching, and never give up hope.